Croeso, Fulcha, Dena, Fulcha Ort, Daymat. Welcome to the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. My name is Sian Esther Powell, and I'll be taking you on a journey through all the myths and legends of the 6 Celtic nations. So that's Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, and the Isle of Man. Hello everyone, and welcome to the 7th episode. Wow. You might have noticed my fancy new introduction there. Those of you who have listened to the rest of the episodes will very much know that this is a very experimental podcast. I'm literally just sat in my bedroom by myself recording this with my Blue Yeti microphone. That's as high tech as I get equipment wise. So I'm always trying new things each episode. But if they don't work, let me know. So if you hated that introduction and it was awful, email me and be like, don't do that again. It doesn't work. But if you like it, equally email me and tell me, oh, that was great. I like getting both types of emails because one's constructive and the other just makes me smile. So there you go. So I'm currently doing my master's in Celtic studies. So, I'm not an expert, but this is something that I'm really interested in. Not only because I'm Cornish and Welsh, so I've got a bit of a personal interest in Celtic myths and legends, because really I love myths, legends, folklore of all countries and all cultures. But browsing sort of podcasts, I do notice there, other than the wonderful Celtic Myths podcast or Celtic Myths pod show, which is really, really great. I love that one. I've listened to a lot of the episodes. But other than that podcast and this one, there really is a huge lack of content for Celtic myths and legends in the podcasting world, as one reviewer noted the other day. Thank you for that review. It's very nice. So here I am, just offering my humble contribution, if you will. So if you've listened to this podcast before, you will know that each episode is focused and based around a particular Celtic nation. So my very first episode was on Cornish pixies. And as this is the 7th episode, so we've gone through all 6 Celtic nations, that's right, we're back to Cornwall, and today I'm going to be talking about Cornish giants. I've been very excited about this episode. Well, I say that at the start of every episode. I'm excited about all of them. I really, really like researching these myths, legends, and folklore, and I love sharing them with people. So yes, Cornish giants today. There's a lot of giants in Cornish folklore and mythology, and hopefully I'm going to cover most of them. So here we go. So I expect that the first thing that springs to mind for many people when they think of giants is likely to be concerning Jack the Giant Killer and Jack the Beanstalk, which is really great because actually that is set in Cornwall. So Jack the Giant Killer was first published in 1711, I believe, so it was, very early in the 18th century. But the folklore concerning giants in Cornwall is much, much older than that, so obviously the authors were using an already existing mythos concerning giants in Cornwall to base their story on. So the character of Jack is the son of a Cornish farmer, and he's really, really strong, and he's also really, really smart. So he's very able to, outsmart people. So it makes him a very dangerous and a very good warrior, especially, coming up against giants. So he earns the moniker of Jack the Giant Killer after he kills Cormoran, who is a Cornish giant. So the name Cormoran itself, it's not Cornish in origin. It's the name used first in the printed versions of the Jack the Giant Killer story. But there was tales and folklore surrounding St. Michael's Mount and a giant that lived there, which I believe is older than the printed versions. So although the name Cormoran wasn't used, there's lots of folklore surrounding St. Michael's Mount. So St. Michael's Mount is a small island off of Marazion in Cornwall. So it's called Mounts Bay, and I believe in Cornish, St. Michael's Mount is called Carreg Lws yn Cws. Probably pronouncing that totally wrong, and I'm really sorry because I am Cornish, so I should probably know better. But essentially I think it means the grey rock in the wood. So there is a theory that there is a folk memory associated with Mounts Bay before it was flooded and before it was an island, when it used to just be woodland. So I really love that. I love the idea of folk memory, because obviously that's where a lot of folklore comes from, these weird bits of ancestral memory that are sort of, carried down through generations by stories. I'm really sorry if the recording of this is a little bit inconsistent. I've been recording over a period of 4 or so days, which I usually don't do. I usually do most of my recording in 1 day or 2 at tops. But you might be able to tell, I've got a pretty nasty cold at the moment, so I have to keep stopping, coughing, and then recording. So if I'm sounding a bit scratchy, that's why. So Cormoran is not the original name associated with the giant on St. Michael's Mount that pre-exists the Jack the Giant Killer story. So Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain is this brilliant weird 12th century book, which is like this attempting to chronicle all of the kings of British history. So it dates back like 2,000 years, and it's like this pseudo-historical chronicling of all of the kings of Britain. It's amazing. It's really great. I really recommend people read it, actually. I kind of love it. So in that, Cornelius is this hero and warrior that's associated with being a giant killer and associated with founding Cornwall. So when he settles in Cornwall, the land Cornwall itself is actually inhabited by giants. They are the sole inhabitants of Cornwall. So that's how far back this idea of Cornwall and giants goes, Giants have been linked to Cornwall for centuries and centuries and centuries. And Cornelius fights this giant Gog Magog. I love that giant name, Gog Magog. And sometimes Gog Magog is associated with St. Michael's Mount as well. So, that's how far back these stories kind of go, and even further than that, because this is just in print. Folk history and folk stories that obviously always predate the printed word, because it's often the printed word is taken influence from folk stories that have existed orally for decades or centuries before that. So Cormoran is said to live in an island on St. Michael's Mount. And in some stories he's said to have built the island itself. He would carry white granite rock from the mainland with the help of his wife. Cormelian, I think his wife is called, which is really funny because it's basically just a female version of his name, and she would carry rocks in her apron. And I think in one of the stories he fell asleep, so being this industrious, pragmatic woman that she was, she went to an area that had greenstones that were closer than the granite rock that Cormoran was using. And because he woke up and he was like, these are not the rocks that I wanted, you foolish woman, I think he kicks her, and the rocks fall from her apron, tumble, and create Chapel Rock. So I love stories like that. It's brilliant. And that's one thing I really wanted to talk about. The prevalence of giants in Cornwall and also in Brittany and in Wales and in all of the British Isles actually makes so much sense. I don't know if all of you listening will have ever been to the British Isles, will have been to Cornwall, but the natural landscape itself is littered with rocks and standing stones. So the idea of giants is hugely prevalent in folklore because of this, to explain where all of these granite rocks came from. There's so many stories of giants throwing rocks and throwing boulders at people that they don't like. There's also loads of stories of giants throwing boulders between each other just because they're playing or they're having fun. tons and tons of stones and megaliths and all sorts of things in Cornwall that are associated with folklore. I've talked a lot about fairies and this idea of the other world and stones being seen as a portal to the other world, but stones are all also associated with giants and stuff like that, this idea of giants carrying stones. And Cormoran, he builds St. Michael's Mount with the help of his wife, and he raids the mainland countryside for sheep and people, I think, sometimes as well. So the physical size of giants in Cornish folklore is very inconsistent. There's not one sort of set height that giants are. They're all over the place in terms of their physical build. So Cormoran is said to be about 5.5 meters high, so about 18 foot tall, and he measures around 9 foot around the waist. Which is, I'm not going to deny that's very, very, very tall, but it's nowhere near as tall, I'm assuming, as the giant Boaster, who I will talk about in a bit more depth in a minute. Boaster, the giant, could stand on 2 points which were 6 miles apart. So, like I said, there's not any kind of consistency on what giants really look like or how big they are. It seems to differ from story to story. So Cormoran has been, stealing and raiding for quite a while. He's amassed quite a bit of a treasure. So in some versions of the tale, the councillors of Penzance sort of convene and they're discussing amongst each other, and they think, well, none of us are really sure what the lifespan of a giant is. I mean, he could live forever. He could be doing this for a long time. So, maybe we should probably sort out this problem now. So they set up a reward for anyone who kills the giant to have the giant's treasure. So in other tales, it's just Jack, loves the idea of adventure and chivalry and fantasy. But in both tales, Jack travels to St. Michael's Mount and he digs a 22-foot trapping pit, outside the cave of Cormoran. And in the morning, after he has finished setting up his trapping pit, he blows a horn and wakes up Cormoran. So Cormoran storms out, he's threatening to eat and boil Jack whole. He's really, really annoyed, obviously, but he doesn't realise that the pit is there, so he falls into the pit and Jack taunts him for quite a while, and eventually he's killed with a blow from the pickaxe. After filling in the hole, Jack is rewarded. He gets the giant's treasure, and the people of the councillors of Penzance are very happy that the giant is now not terrorising them anymore. And in other versions of the tale, a rock is placed on the grave. So in Morva, that's where the tale takes place. In some versions, there is a rock today that's called Giant's Grave, and sort of local folklore of the area says that that's the pit. Beneath that stone is the pit where Cormoran was trapped and killed, and some people say that you can still hear the giant's ghost beneath the rock, which is very, very spooky. I love it. So research done by some folklorists at the university in Durham and Lisbon have come to the conclusion that the story itself, the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, of this stock Cornish character Jack fighting giants, is actually more than 5,000 years old, and it's based on a widespread archaic story form, which is now classified by folklorists as ATU 328, the boy who stole ogre's treasure. So I love that because, like I said, there's all these different versions of Cornish giants in folklore, and to have this kind of story that only came in print in 1711, and Jack the Beanstalk was printed as the story of Jack Spriggins and the Enchanted Bean in 1734. So only since the 18th century has this been in print, but actually its story form is, more than 5,000 years old, which, it shows that folklore and oral storytelling is kind of timeless, and it does influence printed works of, fantasy and fiction. So before I was kind of primarily talking about the 1711 Jack the Giant Killer printed story, but it's actually in Jack and the Beanstalk where we get the fee-fi-foam rhyme. So obviously it's the fee-fi-fo-fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. So that's something that a lot of people know. A lot of people know that rhyme. So Jack and the Beanstalk is obviously a story that's quite well known to lots of people. It's the story of a poor boy who lives, I think he lives alone with his widowed mother, and she sets him, on a task to sell this cow that they have. Obviously, he sells the cow and he gets magic beans in return, and those magic beans create a beanstalk that takes him up into the clouds where a giant lives, and of course he steals treasure from the giant. That's the story of Jack the Beanstalk. So the giant in this story is often called Blunderbore, and actually in some versions he's called Gog Magog, that aforementioned Gog Magog. I don't believe this is to do with St. Michael's Mount, so actually it's interesting. You have this stock character of Jack the Giant Slayer, or Jack the Giant Killer, this Cornish hero, and we've almost got two origin stories for him, being the poor farmer's boy who kills his first giant at St. Michael's Mount, the Cormoran, or this poor boy who climbs the beanstalk and steals the giant's treasure and climbs down the beanstalk again. But that's what I love about fairy tales and folklore, this idea of stories using the same kind of stock hero or archetypal heroes and just sort of altering the stories here and there. Each local town will have its own versions of myths. Each country will have myths and legends, associated with it. Each is very particular, so you'll see these archetypal characters pop up again and again, but in different forms and in slightly different stories. What's really interesting is in the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, there's the giant's wife actually helps Jack escape. So there's this really nice kind of female character that's there to protect this child and to help him escape, protect him from this evil male character. I don't just pull that out of my hat, if you will. It's actually been noted by the Brothers Grimm as well. So the Brothers Grimm drew an analogy between this and the German fairy tale, The Devil with the Three Golden Hairs. So that also has the devil's mother or grandmother. She acts much like the giant's wife, a very, matriarchal female figure protecting the child from harm. So I think that's enough about Jack. We've talked about Jack at some great length now, and as I've mentioned, there are many, many, many Cornish giants in Cornish folklore. So let's get talking about some more of them. I mentioned earlier the Boaster giant, so I'm going to jump straight ahead into the legend of that giant. So there's still an annual Cornish festival called Boaster Day that happens every year, and it's based on this folktale. So Boaster is a very nasty giant. He lives, I think it's in Cornwall, and he can stand on two hills which are 6 miles apart. And he's so huge and so vast that his footprints leave these imprints in the earth that can still be seen today, deep in the stone. So Boaster has a wife that he is not very nice to. I think he mistreats her, He's very horrible to her, and also not only does he mistreat her, but he has a very wandering eye, because Boaster is obsessed with Saint Agnes. He loves Saint Agnes. So Saint Agnes is a local woman who lives near him, and she's very, pious and virtuous. So he is totally in love, totally besotted with her, and he's constantly bothering her. And I've got this mental image of her just being so over it. She is just so done. He's constantly nagging her, and she's like, well, you have a wife, mate, okay? It's not very ethical or moral to be talking to me. You have a wife. And he's like, well, I don't really care. I don't really like my wife very much, and I don't really care. So this irks St. Agnes. She is not here for it. I'll tell you that now. So she, at first she prays. So she does lots of other things before she resorts to drastic action. She prays first, but her prayers go unanswered. He won't listen to her at all. He will not listen to her. So eventually she gives him a task, and she says, right, well, I'll be with you if you can fill this hole at Chapel Porth with your blood. And Boaster sees the hole, and it's a relatively tiny hole compared to his huge form, and he readily accepts this challenge, wanting the missionary Saint Agnes to be his. He's very besotted with her, and he cuts into his arm and lets his blood flow forth into the hole. But unbeknownst to Boaster, St. Agnes has tricked him, and the hole leads directly into the ocean. So he's standing over this hole, waiting for the blood to fill it, waiting and waiting and waiting. Hours pass, and he can't understand why his blood isn't filling the hole, because obviously it's flowing straight into the sea. Eventually he collapses and dies, and that is the end of the giant Boaster. So in defence of St. Agnes, not only was he horrible and he mistreated his wife, he also ate children. He did lots of very nasty things. So when I first heard this story, I thought, oh no, this Boaster giant was in love with this missionary and she was just really nasty to him. But actually no, he was very, very horrible, and actually she probably did the local community a service. So if you have a little Google of Boaster Day, you can see the Boaster giant sort of figures and statues that are created, or a giant puppet, I think it is. It's a giant puppet. And Boaster Day is held at Chapel Porth Cove near St. Agnes, Cornwall. I think it's held on 1st of May every day, so May Day. And it reenacts the events of the Boaster giant legend, and how, it uses dance and costume and singing to tell the tale. I've actually never been, even though I am from Cornwall. I love Cornwall so much, and it's such a beautiful, beautiful county. But public transport is not fantastic, and unless you drive, you really can't get to loads of places. So I've almost passed my driving test, so sorry for the tangent there. So hopefully I'll be able to visit these places soon and have more of a personal explanation to give to you about these things. But yeah, it's a festival that happens every year, and I'd love to go one year, and I think that's brilliant. There's all these little folk festivals and folk customs that still go on in Cornwall today. Of course, there's the Obios that happens May Day every year in Padstow as well. So that's the sort of person dresses up like an Obios. Google that as well, and I'll have to explain it to you, where there's big mask with a big robe, and you basically just dance and sing around town as well. Also, I've never been to Padstow on Obios Day either, so I really need to get myself sorted on these things. I think it's really great that these festivals and folk customs are still being preserved, because not only does it bring communities together, you have fun, you're singing, you're dancing, you're often drinking as well. It also brings in people from elsewhere, so it brings in tourists who are interested in taking part, and I think that's really lovely. So not only are these things good for communities, they're really good for bringing people into Cornwall, and sharing a little bit of Cornwall and Cornish traditions with other people, and I think that's really cool. I love that. So I think I've given giants a bit of a bad reputation with this episode, because there are Cornish giants who are much nicer, who aren't evil. They don't eat children. In fact, there was one giant at Carn Galva. So the giant at Carn Galva, opposed to eating children, actually really liked playing. So this giant lived near the rocks and glades of Carn Galva, and in his free time he liked to chuck around rocks, and he found that was very amusing, very funny, and he would just kick around large stones, and that actually formed the 2 mounds of his home. So that's how he created his home. And so one of his friends that he liked to play with was a young man named Tune. Now, Tune was a local boy, and he'd often play with the giant. He'd walk over to his abode, and he'd see what his friend was doing. And they'd often spend the afternoon playing quoits. So on one particular day, the giant is so happy with the game. They've just had a really nice afternoon, a really nice game, and he has this booming laugh, and he's like, ha 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 ha, thank you, Tune, for this brilliant game, my friend. Tomorrow I will see you and we will play again, or something to that effect. And as he's, proclaiming his happiness of the day and his joy of the company in Tune, he actually taps his friend on the head. And obviously, because he is a giant and he's so powerful and he's so strong, he actually breaks the poor boy's skull. So he's not an evil giant, this one. He never meant to do that. And because he does it, he tries desperately to bring the boy back to life. But when he realises that the boy is dead, his friend is gone, he rocks his body back and forth, and he's crying and he's wailing. And he actually dies of heartbreak about 7 years later. So even the tales of nice giants end really badly for them. And I feel so sad for these giants, actually. Even the nasty ones, they do not have a good reputation, do they? But before he, tragically dies of a broken heart, the giant at Carn Galva is very beloved to the people of Morva and Zena, because he actually protects them against other giants. And it seems his whole life was basically spent, playing with his stones and rocking himself to sleep on a Logan stone that I believe can still be seen there today, and also protecting the people of Morva and Zena, who he really loved. So I think even now you can probably still find this idea of a local giant that once lived there, being very kindly and lovely and very dear to the community. So even though he dies in quite a tragic way, he leaves this legacy behind of being very beloved to the community and not shunned for being a giant. And people weren't frightened of him, and instead people loved him for what he did for them, and that was to protect. So there isn't always this inherent fear of giants as being evil, because in some stories they are actually protectors, and they use their physical size and strength to protect the people that they care about. And there are lots of other little stories as well of giants that, supposedly lived in castles dotted on the countryside and threw boulders at each other. There's lots of local variants of certain stories concerning stones and megaliths connected to giants. As I mentioned before, there are so many other stories concerning giants in Welsh folklore, in folklore of Brittany, because of the natural landscape here being the way that it is. There's so much granite rock, and obviously so many stories surrounding that. I really love granite. I love granite rock. It really just makes me feel like at home. It really does. So I think that's it from me for now. Thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's a little bit more based on printed text than just folklore this time, but I like to change things up a bit with what type of things that I cover. I would need so much more than a half-hour episode if I really, really wanted to dig into all of the giants of Cornwall, Brittany and Wales, for example, because there are so many, On the top of my head, you've got the story of Culhwch and Olwyn, who is Olwyn is the daughter of the giant Ysbyddaden Ben Cawr, and Culhwch is sort of cursed by his stepmother, and said the only woman that you will ever fall in love with, or you will ever be destined to marry, is Olwyn. And obviously Olwyn is the daughter of this giant who lives in the fairest castle of all the lands. It's really kind of a beautiful imagery, and there's so many giants like that. Maybe I will do a whole episode on Culhwch and Olwyn, mainly because I'm happy that I can sort of kind of pronounce the names. Especially Ysbyddaden Ben Cawr. I love that name, that's brilliant. You know what, I will do an episode on that. So again, thank you so much for listening. If you ever do want to get into contact with me, you can do that via Twitter. That's Celtic Myths Pod at Twitter. I'm on Facebook at Celtic Myths Podcast. You can also get in touch with me via email at celticmythspodcast@outlook.com. Really please do that. I really love to hear what people think. I really want to know what kind of things you want me to cover in this podcast, anything really. So again, thank you. I'm just in the process of uploading or publishing or submitting rather this podcast to Deezer, to Spotify, to Stitcher and lots of other places as well. So hopefully this podcast will be much more available to lots more people soon. I've been a little bit slack on that front, but no more. I've also updated my plan. So instead of 50 megabytes, I now get 250. So I can now, I'm not sure how much that is, but it's a few more episodes worth of content a month, I think. So I'm going to hopefully try and upload maybe at least once a month, but maybe even more than that. So watch this space. And again, thanks so much, guys. A big shout out to everyone that's left me a rating or a review. Please do that if you enjoy this podcast. Also subscribe to it, follow it, whatever app or website you're using on there. Give me some stars, give me some words, follow and subscribe, anything. I'm sure that really all helps me. So yes, thank you, and until next time, bye.